This week on States of America with USA Today, election 2020 saw a lot of firsts for women, not just in the White House, but also in Congress and in various cities nationwide. We're talking to one of those mayors about how her city could show us a thing or two about a new era of political cooperation. Also, do we have a transfer of power or not? That's the question Americans, as well as many foreign leaders, are asking President Donald Trump. We've got experts from both sides of the aisle who served on previous presidential transition teams. They tell us why the delay in Trump kicking off this process could put American lives in danger. Let's get into it. On Election Day, Florida showed its overwhelming support for President Trump over President-elect Joe Biden. This after the governor's race went for Republicans. So such a sound GOP win makes you wonder, is Florida becoming a permanent red state? But in the state's largest county, voters backed a Democrat. Here with me now is Miami-Dade County's mayor and first woman to hold this office, Daniella Levine Caba. Madam Mayor, how are you?
Very well. Thank you so very much for including me in your show.
No problem. Let's begin with your history-making campaign. Let me ask you straight up, why do you think it took so long, honestly, for Miami-Dade to vote for a woman mayor in office?
Well, we've had a couple of great women candidates in the past, I have to say. So I'm not the first who had the idea. Ruth Shack, who was a commissioner back in the day and is a dear friend, she ran for office and she did very well. And in the last cycle, Raquel Regalado, who's now coming in as a county commissioner, ran. So it isn't for a shortage of qualified candidates. I just think that the time was right. I'm the right candidate at the right time for this job.
And there are many, I guess, cities still across our country, major U.S. cities, major counties like yours that have never elected a woman in office, or just certain places where the pipeline of candidates aren't women.
I do think that there's a bit of an old boys club in politics very often, and we have had women in commission seats, school board seats, so of course many state offices and city offices. So it isn't a lack of skill again, but maybe for us, it's the time to break the glass ceiling. And I do think that women have come into their own in politics in these troubled times. I think people look to women to be problem solvers, to be compassionate and collaborative and courageous.
Madam Mayor, let me ask, what did your campaign do differently in terms of messaging and policy-wise, given there hasn't been a mayor who's been a Democrat in about 16 years down there?
The good news is that these are nonpartisan positions. So I don't have a D next to my name on the ballot. And while plenty of people who care about these things knew I was the Democrat, some who were on the other side who care about it knew I wasn't the Republican. We have now the largest growing sector are the no party affiliates. And so I was able to garner support from quite a few Republicans as well as the no party affiliates, because I approach this from a perspective of what are the community needs. Again, especially during these troubled times with the pandemic, people are looking for somebody who is going to come in and help us deal with the healthcare crisis, stabilize our health, ready to lead in these troubled times. So we really got past party politics in making sure that we were taking care of our people.
In general, large cities won President-elect Joe Biden the White House. I believe a new study shows that even though the president-elect won only about 1/5 of the number of counties across the country compared to President Trump, his supporters live in areas that make up about 70% of the country's gross domestic product, 70% of the U.S. economy, basically. Given that, do you think you and other mayors should have a direct line into this White House? Right? Should there be a Secretary of Cities, for example?
Wow, very, very novel idea. I'm doing that as mayor of a diverse county that has 34 cities within the county. More than half of the county is now built out into cities, the rest unincorporated. And I think our cities have been left behind. They've not been treated as partners at the table. So I think that would be a wise thing for the federal government to consider. Look, it's all about coalitions. Everybody needs to feel that they're at the table, that they are being treated as real stakeholders. So I think when you have groups that feel disenfranchised, it's time to bring them in.
Do you think that cities get the same amount of respect in our political culture as states do?
I can tell you right here in Miami-Dade County that we have not adequately respected our cities. And, Miami-Dade County is a bit different from other counties in Florida because we do have home rule and we have more cities than most of the counties. A couple of the counties are fully built out, either one city or multiple cities and not really unincorporated areas. So we're unique in having a blend. So I'm looking for a greater balance. I think, people relate to local government more so. So I think it's really critical that local government always have a seat at the table because that's who's closest in listening to the communities, and that voice needs to be reflected in policy decisions.
You mentioned this previously, though. I mean, you all have nonpartisan races there. Not every city is like that, right? Some cities have nonpartisan races for mayor, council, etc., and some do not. Which do you prefer? Do you think everyone should sort of model themselves off of Miami-Dade, or to each their own?
I like the nonpartisan form of government. I find it very liberating. I think that people respect that we're all about making our county a stronger place, regardless of party. I have some ideologies and they inform my thinking on some things, but whether the potholes are filled, whether the buses come on time, whether we deal with sea level rise and protect our property values, I don't see these as partisan issues. And I am excited to work across the aisle with our state legislature, with our federal delegation. And I think that's how people see me, and they're eager to work with me.
First of all, let me ask you a twofold question. Do you think Florida is becoming a red state? Is it a permanent red state? But do you think Florida could also be an example to Capitol Hill and other state, governments and city governments, in fact, on how Democrats and Republicans can work together? Or do you see the two-party system as fundamentally broken?
My tenure started yesterday. I'm second day on the job. And I do believe that we have people of goodwill across the aisle in our state and federal delegations, and that, yes, that we are a model. Definitely, we have the most diverse mix of constituencies here in Miami-Dade County from so many different nationalities, Hispanic, but multiple cultural Hispanics, African-American, Caribbean-American, Native American, and of course, Anglos from every possible origination. So we are truly what we call the salad, not the melting pot. And I think that we live in harmony, that we can work across all those divides, and we can show the state and the nation how to get it done.
Well, Miami-Dade Mayor Daniella Levine Caba, Madam Mayor, thank you for joining us here on States of America.
Thank you. Coming
up, we still don't have an official transfer of power weeks after the election. But as Chris Liu explains, back in the good old days of 2008, it only took about 2 hours to get that process started.
And that's not occurring right now because of the failure of the outgoing administration to concede.
Few people understand the intricacies of shifting from one administration to another as much as my next guest. That'd be Chris Liu, who was the executive director for the Obama-Biden transition team. He also served as Deputy Secretary of Labor and White House Cabinet Secretary under President Obama. He's now a senior fellow at the University of Virginia Miller Center. Chris, that's a mouthful of a resume there.
I can't hold down a job.
Right. So let me ask you, man, I know that there's a lot of things going on with transition, right? You said to NPR, you said this to NPR on November 8th. You said, quote, "The Biden transition is going to face complications that we just didn't face in 2008. It's just not that the economy, but it's also a public health crisis. And then it's trying to plan a transition, most likely in an all virtual environment." This sounds immensely complicated, Chris, even if it was more cooperative back then. Having led this type of process previously, what's at stake for everyday Americans if there's a breakdown in the transition?
Well, presidential transitions, even in the best of times, can be really tricky. So just imagine this. Every 4 or 8 years at noon on January 20th, the entire senior leadership of the federal government, several thousand people, leave their jobs, and then several hundred new people come in to fill those jobs. We're talking about the U.S. government, the largest, most powerful organization in the world. To be fair, you would not run a newspaper this way. You wouldn't run any company this way. But we pull this off every 4 or 8 years. And that is a testament to the professionalism of the career employees that work in the federal government, but it's also to this broader concept of a peaceful transfer of power. And we've done this, and we've done it successfully, and we need to do it because it's not just policies. It's not just the success of the new administration, whichever party, whichever person that is. It's about national security. It's about homeland security. It's about ensuring that services are delivered to the American people without any disruption whatsoever. And so, regardless of what party you're part of or who you're supporting, you should want the smoothest possible presidential transition.
How would you compare then, Chris, to the climate of when President Obama transitioned into office in 2009 from President Bush to this one?
Well, the biggest difference is the level of cooperation that we in the Obama team received from President Bush. About a year before Election Day in 2008, so back in 2007, President Bush instructed his senior team that he wanted to have the smoothest transition in history. And one of the reasons he wanted to do that was because this was going to be the first transition after 9/11. And so we received the most perfect cooperation we could have ever received from the outgoing Bush administration. And as a result, President Obama was publicly effusive after he came into office about this level of cooperation. And he pledged the same level of cooperation to whoever his successor would be. And so that was a significant difference, simply having the support of the outgoing administration. Now, 2008, we were in a recession, as we are now. But the challenge right now is we're in the middle of a global pandemic that's not only upended our lives, upended our economy, but it's upended the way that people do business and interact with each other. And that just adds a whole other set of obstacles and wrinkles to the transition planning that's happening right now.
Right. I envision, you mentioned in your NPR interview, it being all virtual. I envision, as we've all learned via Zoom, Skype, all these different virtual meeting places that we're now in. Is that what we can see, in the transition this go around, that there would be a lot of Zoom meetings between the Trump people and the Biden people? How would this go in a virtual setting?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think like everything else in the world right now, a transition would necessarily have to rely on virtual interactions. The problem is, again, just taking a step back from what's happening right now, a lot of the interactions you have in government have to be in person. And one of the reasons that is because if you're going into the Department of Defense or you're going to the Department of Homeland Security and you're having a conversation about a classified subject, you have to be across the table from each other. You have to be in a secure room of some type. So it's unavoidable that some of these conversations need to happen in person. But leaving all of that aside, the conversations need to happen, and that's not occurring right now because of the failure of the outgoing administration to concede the election and to start this process of transition planning.
Give me a little bit of insight, or maybe something we don't know about transition that maybe you experienced from Bush to Obama, particularly when it comes to the GSA and a letter I believe you might have.
It's a funny thing. As I said, we've been doing transitions in this country for 200 years. We've done them through war. We've done them through depression. We've done them when the people on both sides of this have been bitter adversaries in a hard-fought campaign. So in 2008, on election night, the election was called at 11 p.m. when the West Coast states, their polls closed. And within 2 hours later, I received this letter from the General Services Administration, which ascertained that Senator Obama was the president-elect.
That means let's go back in time here, way back to 12 years ago. You mean to tell me within 2 hours after the election is called, you got that letter from the GSA?
Within 2 hours, and this is and to be fair, this is the way it's always happened. This is the way it functionally happened in 2016 when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton. It always happens this way. It is such a perfunctory thing. It is a formality. Nobody, we're not having a whole conversation about who the GSA administrator is. This whole concept of ascertainment is just a non-issue because it automatically happens, and that's why it's important to look at what's happening right now, not as a partisan food fight. And I know it's easy to sort of say, to frame it that way. This is a historic abnormality. This is a violation of norms. This is not good, to be perfectly honest. This is not good for the American people, and this is not good for the United States that we're in this situation right now.
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out too, though. I mean, I think, many Americans probably have forgotten, right? 12 years ago, when the election was called at 11 p.m. that night, around 2 hours later, you got that letter getting the gears going. I see that President-elect Joe Biden is meeting with governors. Some Republicans, such as Larry Hogan of Maryland, for example, have said they will participate. Outside of the Trump administration, how important is it that Republicans, that opponents, people who didn't vote for Joe Biden for president, openly accept the results?
Again, and I think it's important to understand and take this away from what's happening right now. We have always had this tradition in this country where, regardless of who wins or who loses, we get behind the winner and we hope that that person has the most successful president ever, be the most successful president ever. And just over really the last 30, 40 years, we've had several incumbent presidents who have lost. Certainly George Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford. They were all gracious in defeat. They all pledged their support to the person that beat them. We've even had, over the last 20 years, a really contested post-election period in 2000 between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And after the Supreme Court reached its decision in Bush v. Gore, Vice President Gore conceded, and the transition began. And so, again, what's happening now isn't just the usual food fight in Washington. It is abnormal.
Do you anticipate that President-elect Biden might bring in centrist Republican folks on board to the transition team and perhaps even in the cabinet to foster bipartisanship? And I'm going to follow up with you, but I also want to ask, do you see something like that happening even on some resistance on the left to that? But mainly, let me ask you first and foremost, do you see, Republicans having to play a vital role in the transition and maybe even in the cabinet?
Look, I don't want to speculate on what the president-elect will do or won't do. What I will say is that his message during the entire campaign was, this is a battle for the soul of our nation. He has said repeatedly that even though he is a Democrat, he will govern as an American president. I know he wants to seek all kinds of voices in his administration. And I think that's really where the American people are. Again, I'm based in Washington. I've spent my life in politics. I know how this town is, but I know outside of Washington, D.C., people just want problems to get fixed by Washington. And again, we are in, an economic recession. There's 21 million people out of work right now. Millions of people are facing evictions. Student loan forbearances are about to end. Meanwhile, we're in a period of time where this third wave of the pandemic is worse than the first two. We have, well over 100,000 new cases a day, more than 1,000 people dying each day. The American people just want the federal government to come together to solve these problems. And I think the president-elect will look to all voices and all types of backgrounds to find people to help staff his administration.
Now, Chris, I hear what you're saying there, and certainly that's what, former Vice President Joe Biden campaigned on. But as president-elect, he talks a lot about unity, a lot about bringing the country together. But there are many on the left, Chris, who are openly saying they are not interested in reconciling with Trump supporters. That MAGA march in D.C. over the weekend was riddled with violence, brawls in the street. It was street fights all throughout D.C. Is the president-elect's vision realistic that he can actually, this bridge can be divided, this divide can be bridged here? And what does that look like in your view?
There are certainly, the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, has multiple different factions in this. But I do think the majority of people in the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party and independents, really are just tired of the division and the rhetoric of the last 4 years. And frankly, they just want a return to normalcy. They want a president who is, focused on the nation's problems instead of his own political interest, somebody who's a healer instead of a divider, somebody who looks to unite the country around common values. And so, look, there's always going to be people who want to fight. And look, there's a time for fighting. But I think after this presidential election, which, was the longest we've had in history, I think there's kind of a level of exhaustion. And I think maybe it's just me, but I would like the government, I'd like the people in Washington just to roll up their sleeves and try to fix some of these issues.
Well, Chris Lu, former White House cabinet secretary, who was the executive director for the Obama-Biden transition way back when in 2008. He's now a senior fellow at University of Virginia's Miller Center. Chris, thank you for joining us here on States of America.
Thank you for having me.
Keeping with the conversation on transition, one man who knows a thing or two from the other side of the aisle is former Utah Governor Mike Leavitt, who served as Health and Human Services Secretary under President George W. Bush.
I believe that the party system is not working. We live in a different world today than we did 30, 40, 60 years ago.
The last time a sitting president was fired by the American people was in 1992. But even in that climate, the transition of the White House from George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton was not considered that bumpy. One man who knows a thing or two is former Utah Governor Mike Leavitt, who served as Health and Human Services Secretary under President George W. Bush. Governor, how are things?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. Let me ask you, is it important for the losing candidate to concede in your view? Why is it important?
What's important is that there's a collaborative, cooperative transition between administrations. Transitions are always a time where there's unique danger, and it's just important to the stability and, I might add, the functioning of the federal government and all the lives that affects for that to occur. The question of who wins an election is settled by who gets the most votes at the Electoral College in a presidential campaign. And in other campaigns, it's who gets the maximum number of votes or the majority of the votes. So in the transition, there is a legal requirement that the head of the General Services Administration go through a process where they essentially assert that the candidate most likely to become president is, and then they name the candidate. And by doing so, legally, that then obligates the federal government to begin to make certain assets available to the incoming administration. Assets like access to federal agencies, some federal money, information, intelligence. And there's been quite a discussion about that. But the process of the GSA actually asserting that, or they call it ascertainment, is not a judge dropping a hammer and saying the election will be decided in this way. It is, in fact, a reflection of just the fulfilling of a legal requirement.
Right, right. You were in the Bush administration when it transitioned to Obama. That's been described, at least from what I've read, as a seamless transition. Can you describe how that went? Are there any insights you maybe never shared before? But also, have there been any historic transitions you view that hurt the new president and, importantly, the country?
Well, it happened. It was seamless, and it was a great example. And it happened because George W. Bush, who had experienced a transition that wasn't particularly good, made clear to his cabinet and to his staff, we're going to make this an exemplary, gold standard transition. And we went about fulfilling that obligation. President Obama, to his credit, appreciated it and made the same commitment and gave the same order to his staff. Now, when Obama left and the Trump administration came in, it didn't turn out to be quite as seamless, but I think that was more a lack of preparation than it was a lack of willingness on the part of the administration. Until 2010, transitions were quite informal. But in 2010, Congress, recognizing the need for an orderly transition of power and the complexity of it, actually passed legislation called the Presidential Transition Act of 2010, under which transitions were expected, that they were an obligation of the candidates to do it well and to do it cooperatively. And there's a lot of examples since that time where that kind of cooperation has existed.
Yeah, I was reading up on transitions, and one, it surprised me that in the middle of the Great Depression, we had the transition from Hoover to Roosevelt. In the middle of the beginning of the Civil War, right, we had the transition to Abraham Lincoln's presidency. Are there any that have been, sort of bogged down with some problems that the new president really hurt the new president or the country in that transition period?
Well, the 9/11 Commission indicated that to some degree, the lack of positions being filled made it a disadvantage. I don't know of any specific ones, but I can give you some examples of very good ones. During the Bush to Obama administration, we were going through a big crisis, financial crisis, a liquidity crisis where businesses couldn't get credit. And it was a very dire, we're on the edge of the economy breaking down.
Right.
The incoming administration and the incumbent administration worked together very closly. When decisions were made, they were consulted. They didn't give up their decision process, but they consulted with them at times. And that was the way that a good transition is made. When I was in the cabinet, we were going to the Obama administration from the Bush administration. We actually had we had tabletop exercises where I sat with the incoming Secretary of Health. That's what I was at the time. And we discussed and role played what we would do in certain situations if there was a national emergency. Another thing to remember is that it's not just the political appointees that are involved here. In every department of government, there are career employees who have been there for a long time, who know the ropes and know how things are done, and who are depended upon in the context of an emergency, who are there to help. So there are other components of this that assure that there can be a smooth transition.
Right.
A cooperative relationship between the ingoing and the outgoing is a very valuable thing.
Right. Many may not know this, but President Trump signed a bill in March clarifying the General Services Administration's responsibility during changes in presidential administrations. Governor, is he breaking any laws, or is anything being done improperly for failing to kick off the transition process?
Well, the key point here is the General Services Administration administrator going through this process called ascertainment to determine who in fact won. And that person works technically for the president. The president has not authorized them to do that. That's not illegal. But it is not providing for the optimal transition.
Right.
To the credit of those who work in the White House, there are people involved who have done the things that the law required. There are books and transitions manuals ready to go, and they just haven't been triggered because this ascertainment has not yet been declared.
Does Congress need to step in and maybe think about changing that law where it's not the president who's lost the election is in charge of that transition?
Well, I'll be very surprised if there's not legislation in some way dealing with this. I mentioned the law was first written in 2010. It wasn't implemented until 2012, and that's actually where I was the chair of the transition committee for presidential candidate Mitt Romney. We did the entire transition process to be ready, but of course he did not succeed, and therefore our transition was not implemented. But we were the first to actually use the law, and we discovered a lot of things in that process where some improvements could be made.
Right.
And so in 2016, there was another bill that was passed and signed into law that was part of improving what we had done in 2012. And I'm sure there'll be another one, and I'll bet this is on the list.
The person running the GSA now, Governor, is Emily Murphy, a Trump appointee. What do you think her motivations are for operating this way? Is she just following orders? And does, I think you already answered this. She set a precedent going forward that Congress needs to address. Is she simply following her boss's orders here, or is there some other motivation behind this?
Well, I've not spoken with her. I don't know, but it would certainly appear that she has been instructed that she should not move forward, despite what appears to be clear.
Now, Governor, one of the reasons I definitely wanted to speak with you is that you helped develop the federal pandemic response plan after the 2005 avian flu outbreak, better known to us as the bird flu. What's something you fret about the Biden or the Trump to Biden transition in terms of COVID-19?
We have had good news in the last couple of days. We have seen efforts of the current administration, the Trump administration, paying off here, where we're going to have at least 2 highly effective, safe vaccines. That is very good news. However, in order to get those vaccines produced, get them distributed and injected into the arms of Americans, 300 million Americans, we're going to need logistical planning. And that's an area where, in my judgment, a lot of coordination could and should be used to make certain that there are no steps lost in that process, that we're doing it as rapidly as possible. Will there be a catastrophe if there's not? I don't see it as a catastrophe, but it could be improved on. And what we ought to be shooting for and looking at is how can we do the very best transition possible. The Biden team, they're smart people, and they many of them are highly experienced, and they'll have alternative sources of information. But it would be much better if the 2 teams were working together.
I can't let you go without asking you this political question. You were an advisor to Mitt Romney during the 2012 presidential campaign. I believe you were rumored to be White House chief of staff if he had won that contest. Given Utah Republicans have a bit of an independent streak with President Trump, I'd like to ask, do you think that Trump has broken, I guess, the GOP and further, is the 2-party system maybe broken? I asked that because I saw these protests with Trump supporters in Washington, and there were a number of videos of just outright brawls between them and more left-leaning protesters. Has he broken the party, and is the 2-party system, as John Boehner mentioned 3 years ago, is that fundamentally broken?
Well, I'm just going to sidestep the immediate part of the issue of President Trump. I will say that I believe that the party system is not working. We live in a different world today than we did 30, 40, 60 years ago. People get information, they organize their lives differently, and it's a smaller and smaller group of people who tend to be at a further and further extreme, who are organizing and maintaining the mechanisms of the party. And I think it does require on both sides for some rethinking on the way that process takes place.
Well, former Utah Governor Mike Leavitt also served as Health and Human Services Secretary under President George W. Bush. Thank you for joining us here on States of America with USA Today, sir.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on another episode of States of America. I'm your host, Philip M. Bailey, where we're having honest conversations about the issues that matter most.